Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba T'Shaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba T'Shaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba T'Shaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. This is a pre-recorded show. I still want to encourage people who are new to subscribe. If you like the show, hit the like button. Today we've got a treat. We've got a beautiful guest. The treat is a discussion of the 50th anniversary of hip hop. And we've got a special guest, Davey D, who's a brother who has got a variety of talents, and one of which is he's an adjunct professor at San Francisco State University, a graduate of UC Berkeley, and a specialist in media, but also a strong background in hip hop. And he's been all over the country speaking and doing political work. He does a show on KPFA radio called Hard Knock Radio that reaches over 1 million viewers 5 days a week. He's got him a team that operates this. This brother here is a professional journalist on many different levels. He's got a variety of different things. He's written a couple of books. He's a father. Got him a lovely wife. He lives here in Oakland. And he's active in the community all over the place. So, Davey, it's a real honor to have you and to have a chance to interact with one of the noted scholars on hip hop and on current Black politics in the United States. Welcome, Davey.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on.
I see you a lot in the community, and each time I see and hear you, I learn something, you know. So I think people are going to learn something in this discussion. And the bio on him, a lot of people have thick bios, but it's puff. His stuff is stuff with all kinds of depth and stuff in it, and real heavy stuff. And the fact that one of his main platforms is on KPFA radio, which is a listener-sponsored radio station which means there's no corporate influence in it, means that you're getting his views unfiltered without him having to worry about the corporations putting their mess in. In fact, I recall listening to you once describing that one of your early jobs was working on one of the corporate radio shows until you started doing some stuff that led you to somewhere else. Could you just give a little brief background on that?
I wouldn't say it was like that, but I worked at Clear Channel for a number of years. And around the time of 9/11, they were very concerned that I was doing shows that were talking about why we shouldn't be going to war. Barbara Lee, who was the only member of Congress to vote against giving George Bush a blank check to do what he wants around the 9/11 terror attacks and the response to it, came on our show. I think we were her first interview. We had Boots Riley, who had months before did an album that had on its cover a picture of the World Trade being blown up. And the tenor of those conversations was to look at U.S. foreign policy and question why we did get attacked, that it wasn't as simple as they just hate us and just came here. That led to the another show that we were set to do where we were going to have Ralph Nader and Jesse Jackson come on. And we announced that that would be happening the following week. And that Monday I came in and it was like, hey, you know, we're going to let you go. Thanks a lot. And peace. I think they've been wanting to make a move anyway, because, you know, there was a change in management and they had to figure out how they were going to let me go because of the connections with the community. How can we do this and not get the, you know, the feedback, the kickback? And long story short, they let me go. The late Chauncey Bailey was listening to the show that night and called me up and wanted to come to the show if I had Jesse Jackson and Ralph Nader on. And I told him what had happened. He, of course, responded with a column and let everybody know, and it was on. It was on and popping. The station caught a lot of grief. They actually wound up at one point offering me the job back, but I had really moved on to, you know, programming and you know, getting more money and being in a better situation. So that was that. But I think it was an eye-opener for a lot of people to understand that being able to speak freely when you're on a station that visible. I mean, we're the number one station in the market, and we were the station that influenced other stations. It became apparent that probably in their best interest, they didn't want to have somebody talking about anti-war stuff when the favor at that time was to preach going to war.
Yeah. And sometimes what looks like adversity, you know, when we get hit hard, it could be an illness, a loss of a job. Sometimes that's a very interesting thing because it provides an opportunity and you were already thinking about it. But sometimes it throws us into what may be our real life work, you know. So, and Barbara Lee, one beautiful sister, is now running for Senate, standing the only member of the House or Senate to stand up against the war, and especially against the war in Afghanistan. And she comes out of a military family. And she made the comment that her father had pretty much encouraged her in what she was doing. And then she was Ron Dellum's appointment. I'm the one who radicalized Ron Dellums. Ron Dellums was a social worker in the Hunters Point in the early 60s, an associate director. And we had just run a 6-year movement, the only successful Black Power Black freedom movement in the country. They kicked the ass of the entire economic power structure, built block by block organizing, 145,000 people, gave birth to the free speech movement and the experimental college that's the forerunner of Black Studies at Stake, a whole bunch of other stuff. So Ron had him a master's in social work. And it's interesting that Barbara Lee had a background in social work. And I think leaders are better when they come out of helping professions, you know?
Yeah.
And so Ron came into, when I formed a group that united Chinese Americans, Latinos, and Blacks to take over the war on poverty program called Citizens United Against Poverty. Ron said he's going to come in and keep us honest. But the point is, that was the beginning of his activism. Boots Riley's a former student of mine. Do you know that?
Yeah.
That's a good brother. And his father was a leader in CORE in the New York area. And there's an interesting picture of his father, Attorney Riley, who is sitting with Malcolm X and the head of the National Action Council of CORE, Floyd McKissick, and they get ready to have a debate, not Riley, but McKissick and
Malcolm.
And Malcolm. It's a historic picture, but he's got an outstanding father, radical father. You know what I mean?
Well, let me say one thing about the thing with Barbara Lee. Unbeknownst to me at that time, and probably her, there were a number of hit pieces that had been written. They were already written and ready to come out before she had even spoken, or before they didn't even contact her to get a perspective. And those hit pieces centered around that she was a pacifist and she was one of these, flighty, flower children type of individuals. And one of the things that came out, obviously, in our interview is that she very much wasn't that. She wasn't a turn the cheek type of person. She, had done work with the Panthers. She, was not shy about defending herself. She saw the war in terms of it being power dynamics that needed to be examined, and you couldn't give a president like George Bush free reign. And so that interview became very important because now you had these narratives that were very contradictory to what she was about. And, if you wanted to, get some quotes, you had to come back to that interview and look at it. So sometimes it's important to have these platforms to change the narrative that they had already tried to paint. Anybody from the Bay Area was just going to be one of these hippies who lived in a bubble and didn't really understand, what was at stake, when in fact, what you had were people who had very sophisticated and nuanced understandings of foreign policy and its impact, and how what you do on Monday can come back and bite you on Friday.
And a sense of humanism and a care for people.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Dellums, I'd come back from the Sixth Pan-African Congress. This was 1974. He and I had both gone to San Francisco State. I knew him, by then. And we were hugging, and he was telling me, he said, the Zionists are out to knock me out. You know what I mean? And he thought he would not get reelected. But because he had become a principal, he was always a principal person, but became someone that people could rally behind. They rallied behind him. Then later I get a call from him telling me that he's getting ready to be head of the Armed Services Committee. Now, this is an ex-Marine Corps guy. I was a Marine reservist in my brainwash days. And so it was kind of funny. But now he's in charge. He's going to be in charge of the Armed Services Committee. And this is an anti-war guy in charge of impacting on the biggest part of the federal budget.
Right.
So we had a discussion on that, and I thought that was historic, ironic, and funny. and good.
Right.
You know what I mean? And what I liked about him, like Barbara Lee, and was good, he not only picked a woman to take his place, he picked a woman with integrity. He knew
Yeah.
what he was doing. Because when she took that stand, that took courage on top of courage. I don't care what district you came from.
Yeah. Well, she had death threats, and
Yeah.
we both are members of Allen Temple, and I remember that weekend she had to have Secret Service with her, and the mess. People really wanted to not have any sort of anti-war sentiment grab any sort of momentum, at least in the beginning. Eventually, there was some, but uh, they didn't want to have anything that they had experienced in the past.
Hmm. I noticed from your biography that you were born in the Bronx.
Hmm.
You, I come out of a spiritual system that says that you pick your time of birth, your parent, everything else. And that might really fit you because is it accidental that you were born in the Bronx? Is it really? Look at it how your life is played out. I mean, that's the birth of hip hop, the place where hip hop is born. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, my family on my mother's side are 4 or 5 generations deep in New York.
Okay.
So there's an interesting pattern in terms of that. They weren't um, folks who came up from the South and then just settled, but had been there for quite some time. And so that's a little bit different trajectory. And being in the Bronx, I didn't look at it as, by coincidence or anything. I'm glad that I was able to be a part of things that were emerging in the 1970s. I got involved probably 76, 77, and then moved out here to Oakland, which is, my home. And if I retire, I'll retire my Oakland jacket. Um, Oakland gave me a lot of game, and so to see the emergence of hip hop on this coast was equally important. And then later on, I was able to draw the parallels and not see it as much as something that was just a unique standalone genre or culture, but something that was a continuum of Black expression that has been with us forever. The people of the drum, the oral tradition, dancing is more than just dancing, but sometimes competitive, sometimes ceremonial, sometimes healing, connected to spirit. And, hip hop is just the latest manifestation of Black folks taking those 3 forms of expression and executing it just under a different name. And then lastly, the art piece, which would be graffiti. I think we've always had things that we were crafting that could be left behind and seen as artifacts. And there's a politic and a reason that some of the graffiti showed up, and it had a lot to do with a direct response to the type of ignoring and removal of infrastructure and resources that was going on at that time. The Bronx was when you're growing up, you don't look at it as something that is haphazard. But I lived in a neighborhood where the fire trucks were constant. Fires were all around. On my particular section, Soundview section where I lived, right across the street from what is now the Sotomayor houses, but at the time there were Bronxdale houses. We didn't have those direct fires, but you could see them in the distance off the 11th floor balcony where my parents' apartments were. The devastation that took place meant that people would beautify their own neighborhoods. Like, let's create something out of nothing. Let's bring attention to ourselves. And so those expressions, whether people had the wherewithal and the political understanding to know why they were doing what they were doing, nevertheless, the goal was, if I do this type of art, if I do this type of dance, if I say these type of words and play these type of records, I'll bring attention to myself. If I, come together in community and we have different crews and we're competitive to each other the way that bands may be in another part of the country, I can find a path out of this craziness that we've been thrust into. So that's what I experienced growing up in New York. And then when I came out here to go to college and be with my parents who had moved out here, I was able to see that there were similar forms of expression here in the Bay Area. They didn't necessarily call it hip hop, but we didn't call it hip hop either, not until the 80s. But it was Black folks trying to find a way to be seen, be heard, and platform themselves to express themselves.
I think it's very interesting how you cast the emergence of hip hop out of African American culture, and I think you're absolutely correct when you locate it within certain principles that come out of the culture, one of which is spirit, which is the foundation of the culture, and it's the foundation of all African cultures. And it's what really enabled us to go through the fire of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, wherever we were, in colonialism in Africa, this notion that there's a spirit within us that is free. And it is part of the reason why, we rejected alien forces controlling our lives. So the fact that
you got to remember, Dr. T'Shaka, that at the time, that's not how it was viewed by the elders in our community. It's important to understand the political and social dynamics that exist at a particular point in time. So hip hop was an embarrassment. My mom, when she saw me, come down to her job with a hat turned to the side and a pants leg rolled up, the first thing she did was pull me to the side and say, "Get yourself together. I didn't raise you this way." But you also have to remember the political context of what's going on. A lot of people were the first and the only Black person at their job. She was one of the first to, Black people to work in the bank. She didn't get that job because of her good looks or even her intelligence, but, there had to be, doors open. And so a lot of people in the 70s were kind of on their P's and Q's, or a certain segment of our population was like, I need you to button up, speak good English and act like, you have some common sense. So this hip hop thing with people doing what we were doing was counter to that sort of understanding. And so there was a wholesale rejection. It was rejected by people who were doing radio. There was a rejection by older musicians who thought that what we were doing wasn't music and was cacophonious to the things that they were crafting. And later down the road, they could see that this was a continuation. But in the beginning, they didn't. And it's important to understand that, because it meant two things happened. One, hip hop had to figure it out on their own. Well, three things. Two, the elders that did step in tended to be folks who themselves often got marginalized or were seen as very radical. Nation of Islam, Five Percenters, people who were with the Young Lords and Black Panthers were ones that, kind of encouraged. And if there were elders around, it would be people of that ilk that would be, this is cool. And at least infusing a particular type of politic, into people's minds. So if you went to early hip hop parties, it was no mistake that you might hear Malcolm X being played, over beats, right? Which was an extension of what jazz musicians or jazz DJs were doing. Because, jazz was the protest music once upon a time. And the first time I ever heard Malcolm X was over jazz music with my cousin. So here you had people that were doing that. And I would remember going down to Harlem to buy some of the breakbeat records. Some of them were on the Paul Winley record label, and the guy that would be in the shop would be like, "You need to get this," and hand me like a Malcolm album. You know, you need to get this with your break beats. So some of those albums I still have to this day. But that was important. Some of the first books that I read outside of the autobiography of Malcolm X was, you know, Die Nigga Die by H. Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Alamin, right? And it's in that book that I read, and I still have it, you know, taken from the New York Public Library. He has a bunch of rhymes in there, right? He has rhymes that reflected what he was doing in 1959 in Baton Rouge, where he grew up, where they were playing games like the Dozens, and they was toasting and signifying. And you know, in that book is a rhyme that's very complex, but it among the things that he says is like, I'm hemp to demp the women's pimp, right? Women fight for my delight. And then he goes on to this whole braggadocio thing. Well, that rhyme that's in his book, which was a reflection of what he was saying in 1959 and published in 1969, shows up in a movie in 1974 called Five on the Black Hand Side. And, you know, later on, Sugar Hill Gang takes part of that, and they use the hemp to demp, meaning that this oral tradition and us finding power and strength in how we can manipulate words goes back a few decades. You know, I'm sure H. Rap Brown just didn't make up all those rhymes. He probably got them from, you know, older people in his community that found that they could gain some sort of respect and prowess by having that slick talk, you know, which brings me to my last point is when I moved out here, there were two responses to the emergence of hip hop. One response was, wow, this is from New York, and I want to follow everything that these people are doing. I saw the movie Beat Street. I saw something on Soul Train. I saw a news article, and I want to follow this like a loyal disciple. If they're wearing red, we're wearing red. If they talk a certain way, we talk that way. And most of the people who followed it to the T tended to be non-Black folks or folks who weren't necessarily situated in the hood. The other response was your East Oakland, West Oakland, North Oakland, you know, brothers off the block, whose response to this expression was, oh, that reminds me, or that's just like, you know, something they had seen before, you know. So when they heard, you know, somebody like me rapping, it's like, man, you sounded like my uncle who used to watch Dolomite, or you sounding like, you know, my Uncle Pookie, who was a slick talking, you know, wordsmith, or somebody might even reference, oh, you sound like those people from the Black Arts movements, you know. So there was familiarity with these expressions. They just didn't have a name. And it was always something like, I've seen this before, but not exactly the way that you're doing it, but it's not foreign. And I think that's important because it kind of underscores the fact that we were always singing and speaking, you know, this type of reality just under different, you know, names, but we were responding to similar circumstances of oppression and being either contained or ignored, depending on what part of the country you're in. The policies were to kind of keep us isolated.
Yeah, in effect, they were recognizing similar expressions because it's a common culture, but this is a new form that is coming out of it. And one of the key things in African culture, African American, African Caribbean, wherever it is the word. The spoken word, even though we gave birth to writing, is considered to be primary.
Yeah.
African culture because it carries the force of the truth, the spirit of the truth, which is ultimately God. And so in our culture, all African cultures, even when we write, the best form is when it imitates speech.
Yeah.
In this example you gave, which I think is really beautiful, of the beautifying of the neighborhood, as a way to go against all the uglifying coming through burnings and neighborhoods being knocked down and everything else. coming through what's called graffiti or whatever. That's a common statement that's made in our culture, which is George Washington Carver, when he would talk about why he did his art in his science, because he was an artistic scientist, he said it was to bring beauty where there was ugliness.
Mm-hmm.
Jazz musicians, all of our singers say the same thing. Our writers say the same thing. I don't care what it is, it's the same thing. And this reaction that you all got because you were kind of going against certain standard middle class, respectable standards, you're dressed a certain way, clean and sharp and all this stuff. And here you are coming in with something in reverse. And so people are putting it down, even though they're getting something that is the same spirit. That's the same thing that Thomas Dorsey gets when he's introducing blues back into gospel music, which had become whiteified and had lost its soul. And so now you get some Black people saying, well, I love gospel music, but I hate the blues. And they're both the same. You know what I mean?
Right.
So those expressions you're talking about, those are common actions and reactions, old and new, that keep being repeated over again.
Right. And again, we got to come back to context. I know the term respectability politics it's a catch-all. It may not mean, well, I think people have to understand why respectability politics showed up. It was a survival mechanism, and this goes all, and it was a strategy, a very shrewd one, whether it was, the Negro women's clubs in the turn of the century that, in order to avoid being raped and everything, you had to dress a certain part, or it might have been a strategy in the civil rights era where, the visual of somebody being beaten with a suit and tie was going to resonate and be a sharp contradiction to American rhetoric, foreign rhetoric, like we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, I just saw a video of you beating Martin Luther King and others who were coming out of church versus, if you have your hat on backwards. But I say that is a continuum as a strategy of one of the many strategies that I think we deployed in freedom struggles. How do you get in? How do you get through the door? And we can use words like assimilation and all that. And I think sometimes when we use that, we assume that people didn't have Blackness with them, and I'm very clear that, folks that I came up with did have an understanding of Blackness, but they also were wrestling with and trying to figure out at that particular point in time, was it going to make sense for us to ingratiate ourselves in these institutions? Do I play the game? Because we all came up, look, I need you to play the game. Go to school, keep your mouth shut, play the game. And then once you get in, then you can turn it around. Now we have enough data for a few generations to be like, yeah, but I don't know if they're ever going to let me change the institutions that I played the game to get into. Maybe I need to go and establish my own institution where I can do things on my own terms. But we had to kind of play that out. And I think the post-civil rights era, and you would know a little bit more than I would because you were more of a part of it and that was your thing. But, we had to figure out which way you're going to go. Do you get the gun and go militant, and shoot it out? Do you do the spook who sat by the door? Do you play along and, get into these positions? There were all these different strategies and, and maybe it's still out as to which worked and which didn't work. I will say this, you can lose yourself in any of those strategies if you don't have a way to come back and reevaluate and take an honest look to say, you know what, we might have made some mistakes. And I think that's important. One other point I want to make, because you brought up spirituality. And part of what we've had happen over the years is a diminishing of that and even a demonizing of that. It's like often hear people say, well, you took this Christian thing and somehow that made you docile. And I'm like, well, all the a lot of these freedom fighters during enslavement, from Vesey to Nat Turner to Sojourner. I mean, they, David Walker, they were all pretty devout. But I remind people, the God that they was praying to was not the same that the slave master was praying to, and they saw their spirituality as a liberating thing, and it allowed you not to be afraid. So if I'm filled with the Lord, I'm not afraid to die. So let's go, let's get it on. And that becomes very scary, when you start to realize, like, hey, these people are going to church and they're not coming back being docile. They're coming to church and they're like, ready to throw hands. So how this connects to hip hop in many ways is that the expression that we deployed, our oral tradition, the dance, we didn't know it at the time. We didn't have words for it. But I knew when I was in a circle and we were rhyming against each other, there was a euphoria there. Like, you didn't want to leave. There was something there. Like, man, like, I don't want to go home. I just want to keep doing it. But where you get that euphoria? You get that in church. All of a sudden, the vibration rises and you're going on. In the movie, in the documentary Eyes on the Prize, there's 4 different episodes where they deviate for a moment to talk about how people were singing in the church, right? The Albany one is probably the most prevalent because they really address that. And they say these people would just sing and they would get filled and then they wouldn't be afraid, right? Well, that's the same thing. These expressions, you would lose yourself and the spirit would hit. So we called it raising the vibration. And something magical happens in that moment. As an MC, I would rhyme, and all of a sudden I just hit a point. I feel like I can rhyme anything. The words would slow down. I feel like I could just live inside the beat and I could do whatever. But I'm talking to a jazz musician and they're talking about I'm playing and, horn or whatever. And then something hits and I feel like I can control the notes, right? I can move those keys on the piano. I can, bend my breath in such a way that it's going to emote a sound that you thought couldn't be done. Same thing with the dance. You talk to the dancers, they're like dancing for hours. They're not realizing like they cut their backs or whatever dancing on concrete because they didn't have linoleum and all that at the time. But it's like, as somebody said, when they say break, it means I'm breaking into a spirit and I'm there. So let me close this out while I tell this story. There's a pioneering dancer here named Jerry Renty, right? And he goes back to the 60s, and he was one of the first people in the Bay Area to kind of come up with this boogaloo style. He was known as the Worm. So Jerry talks about he was being interviewed by people at NASA, and he told them that dance is a language. And he broke it down. Now, dance is a language, right? Mm. And he's not a scientist, but they're talking to him about dance. And he says the molecules dance. Everything we do, life is a dance. The way that me and you are vibing is a dance, right? The energy that goes between us is a dance. But anyway, what he talks about, that him and his crew would go around Oakland looking for funk bands. So when we had hip hop crews in the 70s, there were funk bands here, garage funk bands, 3 or 4 member people, drum keyboardists or whatever. And he says that we would go to these places where people were playing the music. And he says there would be a point in time where the band would lock in. All the musicians just come together, in DC, they call it being in the pocket. Here, just be one, just everybody would lock in. And he said, then the audience would lock in. And then he said, we're dancing. We they didn't invite us to dance. We're there. We would lock in. And he says that is at that moment, you could feel the vibration rise. And he called it the moment of all rightness. Now, here's a guy that knows nothing about what we were going through in New York, but he's talking about this euphoria. And it just is important to remember, I think people get scared when they see unbridled Black expression because they can feel like, something is happening. Something's changing in the room. these folks are in a whole other thing. You fast forward that and look at, the documentary that talks about, I'm going to remember it, but they talk about the drumming and the dancing that they were doing, fighting apartheid in South Africa. And they're interviewing like the former police, and they say these people would get to hitting those drums and they'd start chanting. And the next thing you know, they were scared because something was happening. And those folks would say, I felt empowered. And I think, to your point, that spirituality, which they discourage us to have, is the very core of what we're about. And when we allow ourselves to lean into that, we go to heights unimagined, and I think hip hop at its best is when people, whether they had the words or not, were able to lose themselves completely and really express themselves freely, and bring about some incredible things that I think are with us to this day, 50 years later.
Those are deep insights that you're making. And to go back to your point about spirituality and some wanting to downplay it, including some blacks, blacks and enslavement, and you made the point that blacks and enslavement weren't worshiping the same God as whites. Mm-hmm. They weren't Christians. They were, in fact, they had what they called diviners, who were leaders on every plantation. Du Bois, that was one of his great insights. He called them the healer of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful, the natural leaders of the oppressed. He intuitively guessed, I think I'm the only scholar that's proven this, that they were the first founders of what became the Black church at the end of enslavement, when blacks decide to use what they call Christianity as the place where they would drop the culture that they had during enslavement. And what was that? And many who were observing this later, whites and blacks, were saying the same thing, and Du Bois said it. It was voodoo, and it was the African-American form of it. And so, like when the spirituals were sung, they were sung dancing in a circle. The ring shout. The ring shout is a dance that comes from the twa. It's a counterclockwise dance that mirrors the movement of stars and planets. And what the twa and all Africans, Obenga in the Congo, they do the same thing all over Africa. They believed that that dance brought down the vibratory forces from heaven and provided a balance on earth. And so when you're talking this deep stuff about the hip hop circles and the power that you were getting from that, that's real power. And then the vibratory force that's coming from dance, the vibratory force that's coming from singing, the vibratory force that's coming from dancing. And all of it is finally going back to this Jerry Rente that you were talking about, which is getting into what's right. Because the power of the vibratory force of spirit, and any good preacher will tell you this, that if you're going to really preach right, it's got to be what you believe in. And it's got to be the truth that comes out forward to you. So the movements, those were singing movements. Malcolm made a mistake. He said, there is no singing, there's only swinging. And he was putting down the movement for singing. Well, he was wrong. Because singing is a part of, and dance and everything else is a part of everything we do. When we go to war in Africa, we sing and we dance.
Yeah.
And Muhammad Ali, because he gave Muhammad Ali as an example, he wasn't singing, he was swinging. He was doing both. And when he said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali, that was a vibratory force that he was putting out there telling you, I got grace and I'm going to knock you out with something you can't even see. And I'm going to take you to heaven in 7. You know what I mean? That was singing and swinging at the same time. So that's the culture. That's the power. And it also empowers you. And the other point you were making about jazz musicians, many of them will tell you, and I've had this experience on another level, that there's a certain point. I was talking to a sister who's in the UK. Her son is a jazz musician in the US. She observed him play. And one time he played music he had never played before and could never
Mhm.
play again because he hit the zone. The
Yeah,
song took over.
that's the word.
That's
That's
what,
exactly. Yeah, that's the word that we use. You go into the zone,
yeah, yeah,
and and once you hit that, um, it's a whole other thing. Now, again, we don't have the words for it, but we know that that is something that continuously shows up. Um, and let me just say, it shows up in indigenous cultures.
right,
And I want to say that very clearly because if you talk to our indigenous brothers and sisters here, similar type of things. We just had a big conversation the other week about that. You go to other parts of the world, go through Central and in South America, you'll find oral tradition, people of the drums. You just don't sing for the sake of singing, but it's all connected and ideally designed to hit higher powers. And you know, and people have different words. Open your third eye, open your chakras, you know, reach a vibration, but it's there. Um, there's a movie called Rise, and in the movie Rise, which is about crump dancing and clown dancing and stripper dancing coming out of LA, you hear those individuals say very similar things. And to your point, they talk about painting their faces, right? And they're showing them paint. They ain't never been to Africa, but you're looking at these paints and they got these markings, right? At one point in the movie, they juxtapose the dancing that they're doing with dances that are taking place in various parts of the continent. But that's not the most important part for me. I mean, it's good to see that connection. Is the main dancers that they're showing? They're showing this woman that's crumping, she's pulling off shirt, she's doing all these moves. She hits that zone, and then she falls out. And then the guy holds her, and he said, "That's what we're waiting for her to get struck." You know, she's struck. You know, now, you know, and that's what they dance until they got struck. So it's something that, you know, to your point, we got to lean back into. We got to explore it further. We have to go. We can't be afraid of it. And it's interesting that people would have a disdain for expression in a secular sense, while they would do the exact same thing in a church setting.
right.
You know, like you're mad because so and so is singing the note and elongating it, and you know, singing a love song with all their heart and soul, but you're doing that when you're in the church,
Right.
and you and it's raw expression, and it's that expression that used to be banned. Like, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it. You better not do it. You know, tuck your shirt in and become a little bit more refined. And even with that refinement, you found that people were still able to hit those spiritual, that spiritual zone.
Right. Those are very important things because we're in essence spirits in a body. And so if you don't finally get into your source, then there's real weaknesses. You know, there's a lot of things you can't sustain in life. You might decide to take your own life just because you think there's a hardship that you can't overcome. Old Black folks didn't think that way because they thought no matter how bad things were, they could get better because they had this source inside of them that told them that there was something better. Now, we only have about 5 more minutes, so I just want to hit the top of this because you've gone into depth, and I like how you've done this in terms of where hip hop was coming from. It's depth, it's soul. There's a brother named Bakari. I know you're familiar with him, hip hop theorist, and he puts forward this idea that the creators of hip hop were what he called the bridge generation. They were between the generation that had occurred earlier, Black Power, the Panthers, all of this, and then through them, they give birth to what's hip hop, and then hip hop comes out of that. What do you think of that? And if so, how does that play out in the origin of hip hop?
Well, you're talking about Bakari Katwana, a good friend of
Yeah.
mine. Yeah, you know, again, let's look at what's going on. You talk about the late 60s, early 70s, which is arguably the height of the Black Power movement. Alongside the Black Power movement, it's the Black Arts movement. And you're seeing unbridled expression, culturally speaking. You have your last poets, you have, Gil Scott, you have a lot, the whole notion of soul. Soul music is a big deal. It's on the cover of Time magazine. They're trying to figure out, how do you get this soul? You have a fear of that, like what is it really, and in the language of soul, Dr. Martin Luther King talks about it. Ironically, he talks about it on August 11th, 1967, right? Because hip hop's birthday is August 11th, 1973. But he talks about the language of soul, and he talks about how people would lose themselves in the dances that we did. And, and he gives a whole speech about the importance of culture, right? Which is, if you ever get a chance to hear that speech, it's incredible. So I bring this up to say that as you have this going on, and you start to have the word militancy being put up on Black liberation struggle, right? That becomes a dirty word, because people ain't turning the other cheek no more. They're not using that strategy as much. There's an attempt to bring out all the stops and put that down. Let's assassinate some folks. Let's jail other people. Let's downplay it. Let's, you have the famous memo from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, where he's telling Nixon, pay attention to the Black middle class, pay attention to these other ethnic groups, get away from the militants, right? And then you have a reintroduction of heroin as the war is ending. So you have a lot of things happening at once, which really meant that there was a generation, the bridge generation, that shows up, and they don't have the same infrastructure, right? You're also at a time where, unless you were smart enough, like like we had to lie about who my father was, like, because we were getting aid from the state, so we had to refer to him as an uncle. Like, oh, that's my uncle, and because somebody would be like, I think there's a man living in the house. So you had all these different things that were going on. And so many people, as I said, had to find their way. Their older brothers who went to Vietnam, or older, cousins came back, they were still shell-shocked or out of it, so they couldn't lead. The generation that was more militant were being taught a harsh lesson, that there would be a price to pay for that. And the survival of that would have been more the civil rights movement, which would have been the lesser of all those evils as far as the power construction, structure was concerned. And it was also in line with Moynihan's memo to Nixon: pay attention to the Black middle class, focus on them, open doors for them. And so there was a disconnect with the raw and unbridled expression and experiences that many people were going through. Some people brought into the notion that in impoverished areas, we caused it ourselves. So Black people were blamed for the fires in the South Bronx. And they ignored the fact that people in those communities actually rebuilt those buildings, and some own them to these days, right? They ignored the resistance, but they blamed us for that. But they were blaming us for the burnt out stores in Watts and in Detroit and in Newark and every other place where people exploded because of oppression. And so to Bakari's point, yeah, that is the bridge generation that was in between and for a period of time orphaned. Like, your father had to go away for a while, and then they they might have come back, but by the time they showed back up in your life, you're a teenager, or you're damn near a man, a woman. So it's a different type of dynamic. There was a lot of missed lessons that I think collectively we didn't have, and people had to figure it out. And I'll close with this: that first generation, at least in New York, the dirty little secret of them is that they too got caught up or was a part of, the substance abuse and, all that type of challenges. So it wasn't really until the later generations that came out in the late 80s that they were able to try and get some footing and then establish some infrastructure, because some of those older pioneers just wasn't in a position to do what needed to be done.
Yeah, and so to wrap up, the bridge generation is also like what we've been talking about, which is there's this old culture, African American culture, and then these new forms coming up. And the bridge generation is both drawing from what was before them, Black Power, Civil Rights King, Malcolm, a host of others, James Brown, which becomes real key in terms of the beat, and then passing it on and then innovating this new art form that is a continuation, but an innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So 50 years of it, not bad. You know what I mean?
No, there's a lot to be proud of. And
the thing I'd say is that when Bakari wrote his book, which I think is an excellent theoretical piece on hip hop, the hip hop generation had not yet found its political voice. And so with Black Lives Matter, there's a mature enough that it puts the fascist president who wants to do his second term and really do it out of the White House, facing the jailhouse, but potentially reelectable after all the charges that have been laid on it. But it's a hip hop generation that draws from some of the best of the Black Power, Black Freedom movement and improvises something that powerful. So I think that's a statement.
Yeah. I think there's always been a politic, and I'm going to use this word as we wrap up. It's intentionality. So you can't really talk about our politics, even with BLM and the emergence, without talking about the clandestine meetings that were taking place in New York in the mid 80s at a place called the Latin Quarter. And there used to be a gathering of people, and it was called the Meeting of the Minds. Like, people didn't know about these meetings until years later. So in those meetings were the top artists of the day. It might have been Melly Mel, might have been KRS, it was led by the people who were part of the Black Watch movement, X-Clan, Paradise Gray, and Lumumba Carson. In those meetings were the December 12th movement, Sonny Carson, and others. And what was discussed was, what would people do to change, one, the value system that was currently plaguing the community. So everybody was wearing fat gold chains, and they said, if you want to perform at this hot club, the Latin Quarter, you got to take those chains off and you got to put on these African medallions. There was a reading list that people had started to embrace, and the term Afrocentricity started to come up. So, so we knew about Melania Santa and with reading Chancellor Williams. So there was all these books that people were reading, and those books started to find, themselves in the music. So, for example, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet is based upon Francis Cress Welsing's ISIS papers, right? It's the soundtrack to those theories. The other thing that they said is, like, look, whenever you do a video, make sure in your video you put a figure, a historic figure. So you go back and look at the videos between the 1980s and early 90s. You see Haile Selassie, you see Malcolm, you see, all sorts of people in the videos. Queen Latifah subversively works with Fab Five Freddy, and they do a song called Ladies First, but they make it an anti-apartheid video where they put in all that footage, right? That was something that was intentionally done. It wasn't something where they said, we're going to do an anti-apartheid movement. They just said, we're just putting figures there and would hope that that would catch wind. The other thing was a commitment to involve themselves with the anti-apartheid movement, right? So what we now call the golden era, not only gives birth to all this Afrocentric thought that these scholars had put out, but now that's being reflected in the music. And then later on, it gives birth to a group collective called the Native Tongues, the Jungle Brothers, tribe called Quest,
Mhm.
De La Soul, all these people that have a particular type of consciousness that is happening. That runs parallel to the amplification of gangster rap that was showing up here in the West Coast. And that became a problem, because of the shock and awe of it. But what was concerning, and which they tried to keep hidden, was the gang truce that went along with it, right? That people were like, look, let's try and do this gang truce, and let's have that reflected in the music as well. So it was like, no, we're not going to really highlight that. So we can get a whole thing, but those building blocks meant that you had a generation of people that understood it was important to have a politics. So by the time you move 20 years down the road or 10 years down the road into the early 2000s on up, you have people that are already acclimated and know that this culture has to have political thought in order for it to survive. And that gets executed with people that started to organize. Obama doesn't get into office without that organizing that existed from those people, right? And then BLM is born out of that, with a younger generation who I think took it to the next level and expanded on that politic to a large degree.
Well put. And we're going to have to wrap up at this point. Davey, I really want to say this has been a beautiful discussion, and you've given some depth and insight that is usually lacking, even in the writings on hip hop, a lot of them that I've read at least, going into origins and into roots. So thanks.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed. I've learned a lot from what you've had to say. I'm proud of you, brother. We fought so that we would have youngsters like you. How old are you, by the way, brother?
Well, I'm over 21, and I'm not.
Oh, you do that? 'Cause I know at hip hop, it ain't too cool to be too old.
I'm not as old as you yet,
Yeah.
and I know you look.
Well,
what are you like? What are you, 50?
80, 84 this Friday.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
84. I've been in the movement 63 years ongoing. And
Okay.
to see the growth and see people like you, to see the various creative forms that our people have come up with, it makes me glad, makes me happy. So this has been a beautiful discussion. Thank you, brother. And I'm going to be asking you for other exchanges down the road.
Okay. Well, it's mutual, and we'll definitely build. Thank you. Talk
Okay.
to you in a bit.
Okay.
Peace.
Peace.